And now we're thrilled to talk to Marci Shore. Marci teaches modern European intellectual history at Yale University. She is the translator of Mihail, she told me how to say this, and I'm going to get it right, Głowinski, The Black Seasons, and the author of Caviar and Ashes, A Warsaw Generation's Life and Death in Marxism, 1918 through 1968. The Taste of Ashes, The Afterlife of Totalitarianism in Eastern Europe, and The Ukrainian Night, An Intimate History of Revolution. In 2018, she received a Guggenheim Fellowship for her current book project, A History of Phenomenology in East Central Europe, tentatively titled Eyeglasses Floating in Space, Central European Encounters That Came While Searching for Truth. She has written about Ukraine for The New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, and the New Republic, among other places. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
We really appreciate your joining us. We just talked to Anton Trinovsky about the current political situation in Ukraine, which he's been covering for the New York Times, but we'd like to talk to you about the historical and artistic antecedents to that situation. So we wanted to start with some very basic recent history. We were just discussing how to pronounce Maidan, so which I think I got right. So
that's a lot easier than the one I had to do.
Yeah, I'm getting away with the easy assignment here. But what was the Maidan for our listeners, and when and why did it happen?
Well, the Maidan is a place. It is the large city square in the center of Kiev, but it has now become a name for a revolution, which is also called the Revolution of Dignity. And the story of that is, I mean, it's very much a post-Soviet story. You know, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, Ukraine, somewhat by default, gets its independence in 1991. There's a long period of post-Soviet transition and struggles for democracy. In 2004, there is an election between two guys named Viktor Yushchenko and Viktor Yanukovych. The short version of that story is that Yanukovych, who is very much the post-Soviet gangster type, tries to poison Yushchenko with dioxin, which to a certain extent succeeds, and cheats in the election and thereby declares himself victorious. At that point, Ukrainians go out onto the streets, onto the Maidan, the big square in the center of Kiev, for 3 weeks. They protest, it's peaceful, and somewhat miraculously, it works. The election is done over, the votes are counted, Yushchenko is declared the winner, everybody is happy, they go home. And it seems like now maybe the moment when everyone lives happily ever after, and Yushchenko is going to lead us to European integration and liberal democracy, which back in 2004, people were still thinking might represent the end of history. And we were all going to live happily ever after. And then the even shorter version of that story is that Yushchenko turns out to be a disappointment, and there's infighting on his team, and it all falls apart. And in 2010, Yanukovych wildly improbably decides he's going to return, which it really seems like it couldn't possibly happen, but he hires a really slick PR agent from a little boutique industry in Washington, which is basically PR for, you know, gangster types who would like to become president. And this guy, even though he doesn't know Russian or Ukrainian, goes over and gives Yanukovych a makeover and a new haircut and some new clothes and helps him with his speeches. And Yanukovych comes back in 2010 to this time legitimately win the election. And he is who he always was. But at the same time, he nominally seems to be leading Ukraine towards a potential course of eventual European Union integration, you know, which is what a lot of people in the opposition to him really, really care about. And in 2013, he was all set to sign this association agreement with the European Union, which was not an extraordinarily great agreement. I mean, it would have involved Ukraine undertaking costly reforms. It likely would have provoked retaliation from Russia. It promised at the end of the day, no, not necessarily European Union membership, but it was a foot in the door. It was a symbolic step in the direction of Europe. It was a promise to the young generation that Europe might be open to them, if not today or tomorrow, then someday. And everything was all ready. The ceremony was prepared. The pens were laid out in Vilnius. And then at the 11th hour on November 21st, 2013, Yanukovych, under pressure from Putin, says, no, I'm not going to sign. And at that point, there's this sense of despair. Above all, on the part of a young intelligentsia, on the part of students, and still nothing might have happened, but this 32-year-old Afghan Ukrainian journalist posts a note on Facebook that day and says, hey, you guys, if you're really upset, come out, let's be serious, come out to the Maidan by midnight tonight. And then he said, likes do not count. And later that line struck me because I thought likes do not count, and I'm translating literally from the Russian. It was often mistranslated, but there's no reason to mistranslate it. It's a rare moment when it translates perfectly. It's literally likes do not count. That's a sentence that would have made no sense before Facebook, literally, and it now it becomes a revolutionary slogan, for the 21st century. And people come out that night. Largely young people come out that night. And it's not just because students are always more active. It's not just because they're always more idealistic. They also have the most to lose. Whether or not Europe is going to be open to them, sets the horizon for their whole lives at this point. They come out on the city square. They also come out in lots of other smaller city squares and smaller places. They're not interested in language politics. They're not interested in ethnic politics. Like their slogan is Ukraine is Europe. That's it. Like they want Europe to be open to them. They want to be part of Europe. They don't want to deal with political infighting. They don't want to deal with representation from political parties. They just want Europe. And the whole thing might have fizzled out, had Yanukovych not decided some 9 or 10 days later, at the very end of the month, to send in his goons, his Berkut, the riot police, at 4 a.m. to brutally beat up the students in an act of violence that hadn't been seen in public on that kind of scale against nonviolent protesters really in the time of Ukrainian independence. So it was a violation of a social contract. I think, not that I have any privileged epistemological access to what was going on in Yanukovych's head, but that he's thinking like, okay, you're going to do something shocking, and the parents are going to freak out and they're going to pull their kids off the streets. And that was where he miscalculated. Because instead of pulling their kids off the streets, the parents joined them there. A day later, you've got close to 1 million people on the streets of Kiev. No one has ever seen that many people on the streets of Kiev. And now it's no longer just Ukraine is Europe. Now it's, we will not let you beat our children. That was how the Maidan got started. I should let someone else talk now.
Well, that's okay. I was actually thinking so much of this, and we'll get to this later in our talk, reminds me of things that President Trump has done. It reminds me of that when he cleared that square out near the White House to go hold the Bible up. Seems very similar. But we're going to stick here and sort of connect some dots here for foreign policy challenged Americans like myself. These Maidan protests eventually oust Ukrainian President Yanukovych. He leaves, goes to Russia. Is that right? He sort of flees the country. Okay. And then not long after that, Vladimir Putin, who runs Russia, boss of Russia, that they're going to annex Crimea, which is part of the Ukraine, seems directly related to these protests to me anyway. And then that works. It happens. They just take over part of the country. Yeah.
And the question, unfortunately, that I suspect most Americans will have is, why is Ukraine relevant to us? I think that, countries fight over their borders all the time. One possible answer that I found really helpful was in an article you wrote for Foreign Policy, which was called "Ukrainian Corruption is Trump's Native Language." And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you came to that conclusion. I was just reading up in preparation for this episode. I was reading about, the corruption rankings and how highly Ukraine lands on that list.
We spend a lot of time thinking about what Trump's native language is on this show.
But I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about how you came to that conclusion and read to us from your article.
Yes, of course, I'd be happy to. I was following what was going on in Russia and Ukraine very closely in 2013, 2014. Now, I, of course, am a Slavicist, and so every day, everywhere, you're all across the world, there are people making decisions to risk their lives on behalf of values that may seem crazy, may seem idealistic, may seem noble, and of course, we can't possibly pay attention to them all every day. But in some sense, the world is divided into people you know personally and people you don't know personally. And so when there are people you know personally who make that decision to go out on the streets, it's impossible to turn away. And I know how I felt during the Maidan was quite similar to how friends of mine from graduate school who became historians of the Middle East felt during the Arab Spring. I mean, in some profound way, I feel like we are all, we live in this world together. We live in this world in an interrelated way. The direct connections that later emerged between what was happening in Russia and Ukraine and the United States were, I would say, an unpleasant surprise. But if I understood sooner than a lot of my friends and colleagues in the States what was happening here when Trump came on the scene in 2015 and then through 2016, it was not because I was smarter than they were. It was because I had been following what was happening in Russia and Ukraine, and there were things there like post-truth, that I understood what they were just a little bit faster because I already had the concept in my head. That was, of course, not something that had ever been desirable. I mean, in some way, you can look at the story that Frank Foer tells in some very good articles and say, okay, Yanukovych got this slick PR guy to give him a makeover. He's very grateful, gives him lots of expensive caviar after he wins the election. Then, he has to flee the country after committing a massacre, on the Maidan in February 2014. He flees across the border to Russia. Well, that slick PR agent, whose name was Paul Manafort, is out of a job. And we all know what he does next.
Fucking Manafort. He's everywhere.
Seriously, no. And Frank Foer wrote a great piece, back when Trump was running for president, and people like myself were very, very nervous. I didn't think he was going to win. I was afraid he would, but I didn't think he would. And Frank wrote this great piece saying, basically, you don't think that Trump can win. You don't know, you don't know Paul Manafort. And I had met Frank in Kiev, in 2014, and and he understood what he did because he had followed what was happening in Ukraine. And that's one of the many ways in which we're all living in this world together. And then there were certain motifs, which is what I wrote about in that article, one of which was, I think a lot about language because I'm a writer and I write about intellectual history. And so we're always thinking a lot about language. And one of the things that came up during the Maidan was a word prodajnost. Prodajnost in Russian, prodajnist in Ukrainian, and it literally means saleability. I mean, you could talk about venality in English, although it doesn't quite have that somewhat quaint Victorian register that it does in English. And it's an alternative word for corruption, but it's slightly different. If you think of corruption as a kind of concrete instance of something or a concrete practice, prodajnos, the saleability, refers almost to a kind of existential state. The idea that anything, and more importantly, anyone, can be bought or sold. And so you're living in this world where there's this idea that people can be bought or sold. And this is the world of the gangsters. This is the world of Putin. This is the world of Yanukovych. All right, I'm going to read from an essay from the Decoder series in Foreign Policy titled Ukrainian Corruption is Trump's Native Language, which was published in October 2019. The Revolution of Dignity is the name given by Ukrainians to the events of 2013 and 2014 that culminated in a massacre in Kiev Central Square, the Maidan. Here, the full meaning of dignity emerges only in opposition to two other words, proizvol and prodajnost in Russian, svavilia and prodajnist in Ukrainian. Ukraine is a bilingual country. Proizvol means arbitrariness in the sense of arbitrary will, caprice, abuse of power. It is the antonym of rule of law. It suggests an absence of all legal boundaries. Продажность means the quality of being for sale. It is a second word for corruption, the first being the cognate corruptia, although the two are not precisely synonymous. Продажность is larger than corruption, akin to an existential state. It speaks to a way of being as opposed to a particular crime. In general, продажность suggests a situation in which anything, and more particularly anyone, can be bought or sold. In other words, it evokes a situation in which everybody has a price. A long Central European tradition has held that when times turn dark, philosophers begin calling back to Kant. This is such a moment. The relationship between price and dignity was the point of departure for Immanuel Kant's moral philosophy. Whatever has a price can be replaced by something else as its equivalent. On the other hand, whatever is above all price and therefore admits of no equivalent has a dignity. For Kant, to be a person is to have no price. It is to be neither replaceable nor exchangeable. To be a person is to have dignity. The revolution of dignity is perhaps best understood in this Kantian sense, a revolt against продажность and произвол, the essence of which is being treated as a thing and not a person. In the years since the Maidan, the struggle of the Ukrainian political reformers has been this. How can they make that moment of transcending price and asserting dignity last? On the other side of the Atlantic, in the United States, the trend in the past years has been in the opposite direction, away from dignity toward продажность and произвол. In 2004, a decade before the Revolution of Dignity, Ukrainian presidential candidate Viktor Yanukovych and his team were found to have committed widespread election fraud. They were also widely believed to have poisoned Yanukovych's opponent, Viktor Yushchenko, with dioxin. At that time, mass protest on the Maidan succeeded in forcing a second election. This time, Yushchenko was declared the winner. Afterward, it seemed impossible that Yanukovych, so thoroughly discredited, could ever come back. Yet Yushchenko proved a disappointment. And Yanukovych hired a slick American consultant whose boutique industry provided high-level PR for gangster types with presidential ambitions. In 2010, Yanukovych reemerged to win, this time legitimately, the Ukrainian presidential elections. The consultant's name was Paul Manafort. Following his victory in the 2010 elections, Yanukovych gave Manafort a thank you gift, a jar of black caviar worth over $30,000. As president, Yanukovych embodied the free reign of произвол and the culture of продажность. The latter had begun long before Yanukovych's presidency and enveloped everything from parking meters and billboards to university exams, construction permits, and medical care, extending to the court system and ministerial post. Everyone's used to it, explained the Ukrainian poet and novelist Serhiy Zhadan. It's become as if a norm, and it doesn't appear anomalous to just go pay off the teacher so that the kid doesn't have any problems. Many Ukrainians look to eventual European Union membership as a distant hope of the rule of law.
Thank you very much. I have to say, when I read that part about the back to Kant idea in Europe, I thought, well, it'd be really nice if people in America even knew who Kant was. Crying out loud, we could go back to Kant. But, you know, we've already mentioned Manafort, appearing in both the Ukrainian and American presidential elections. And so it seems to me not surprising that the major foreign policy challenge of Biden's presidency would be Ukraine. I mean, that's why we're doing this episode, is because Russia is about to invade this country, it seems like. You see all these connections. You talk about the fraud that Yanukovych committed in 2004. Trump tried to commit election fraud in 2020 and would have been happy to do so if he could have pulled it off. You know, they both at some point had Manafort as an advisor. There are all these parallels, you know. It seems like these people are learning from each other, the people who are in favor of this everything should be bought and sold and people should be treated as things style of government.
We're now living in a world where there's a level of interconnectedness that feels unprecedented. I mean, one of my friends and colleagues, who is a sociologist originally from Kiev, lived in Petersburg, then in Germany, and now works in Vienna. And she said, when I used to get on the plane, to go from Vienna to Kiev or Petersburg, I felt like I was going into a different world. And I don't feel that way anymore. Like now I feel like we're all in the same world, and the pathologies of this world are inescapable because they follow us wherever we are. And I definitely have that sense as well.
Sugi, I think we could skip your question there and move on to the Donbas region. Can you want to just sort of figure out how to do that?
Sure.
I mean, I think you can just say like the place, one of the places where Putin's troops are now being built up is in this Donbas region, and then talk. Am I saying that right, by the way? Is that the
Donbas?
Right Donbas.
Donbas. Okay. 3, 2, 1. So Putin's ambitions in the Ukraine focus on specific regions, including the Donbas, which is the eastern part of the Ukraine, kind of along the Russian border. And that's presumably where this invasion, if that's the right term for it. And of course, Putin and the Kremlin are saying that it's only military exercises. But that's where this is going to happen, or where it's already happened by the time this episode has come out. I'm not sure. But and this is also the fictional terrain of one of the Ukraine's best known writers, Sherhi Zhadan, who you've also mentioned. And you wrote an excellent New Yorker article in 2016 about him. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about his connection to the Donbas region.
Yes, I would love to talk about that. He's a phenomenal writer. The Donbas is a post-industrial mining region in the eastern part of Ukraine. So Ukraine is a large country. It's a large country, it's a diverse country, it's a vibrant country, it's a bilingual country. The bilingualism is very important. I'd be happy to talk about that at some other point, if you'd like to. In 2014, I mean, it seemed, to the extent that anybody was able to follow what was actually going on in Putin's head, he was trying to instigate instability in Ukraine by trying to instigate rebellions and war wherever he could. So in the spring of 2014, it was very unclear where there was going to be a war, where there wasn't going to be a war. It looked very possible that, Kharkiv, Odessa, what was then Dnipropetrovsk, a city that is now just called Dnipro, Donetsk, Luhansk, Sloviansk, it seemed that a war could break out any of these places. So-called Russian tourists, were coming across the border to try to instigate that. And nobody knew exactly what was going to happen. It's not clear to me that Putin knew what was going to happen. He manages very quickly to, illegally annex Crimea by sending in so-called little green men. The little green men, refer to guys in unmarked camouflage who just appear, obviously, Russian agents of some kind, but not claiming membership in any identifiable body or military division, and take over. This, by the way, another point of connection, we got our very own little green men in Oregon. At the beginning of the pandemic, you might remember during the Black
I remember
Lives
those
protest.
Unmarked vans that were going around.
Exactly.
Yeah,
they were
fun.
little green men. They were literally little green men. Like nobody's, it's unclear exactly who they are. They don't seem to have to follow any rules. They're not under the rule of law. They've been somehow, called up as like hit guys for the president, but they seem to be operating outside the framework of any kind of rule of law. So that's what happened in Crimea, and it happened quickly, and he was allowed to get away with it in a way that shouldn't have happened, but nobody seemed to know what to do. Still more brutal, I think, has been this war that has now just been going on in a kind of simmering way since then, and after failing to provoke these separatist rebellions in Odessa, Kharkiv, and Dnipropetrovsk, he succeeds at certain places in the Donbas, this mining region, in the Far East, and it's a very strange kind of a war. Because at the beginning of the war, it's not exactly an invasion, but it wouldn't have happened without elements of an invasion. There are guys coming across the border. Some of them are Russian soldiers explicitly. Some of them are Russian volunteers. Some of them are Kremlin agents. Some of them are local thugs. Some of them are local guys with Russian nationalist inclinations. Some of them have their own separatist inclinations. Some of them just seem to be random local thugs. Nobody knows exactly who they all are. And there's a lot of anarchy. One of the stories that this wonderful young Polish journalist who did some of the best reporting on the war in the Donbas for the first 3 years there, Pavel Piniądzik, goes over there, and people are shooting and people are trying to figure out what's going on. And local people are coming up to him and they're asking Nashi, and Nashi means ours, in the sense of like, are they on our side? Who is who? Like even the people who living there weren't sure who was who. Who is on our side? Who's shooting at us? Who's shooting at the enemy? Who is the enemy?
It seems like so much of what you're talking about is about the imaginability of conflict and the language that gets put to it. And one of the ways in which Putin succeeds in very much kind of like a post-truth or maybe in post-truthiness sense is that if you just sort of deny what you're doing, like, oh, these are military exercises. Oh, like these people I'm not sponsoring them, or they're not aligned with me exactly. Like my family is of Tamil Sri Lankan origin. And a lot of this sounds very familiar to me, kind of along the lines of the way that Sinhala majoritarianism has operated in Sri Lanka, the way that they're sort of state aligned forces is the phrase that I tend to use. But what does that alignment look like on the ground? And then when you're trying to explain it to Americans, like it's sort of, right, this isn't how we imagine invasion happening. Right. I don't think. And so in order to stop an invasion, you have to decide that that's what you're going to call it. And but
you can imagine it that way too. I mean, think about the January 6th insurrection is exactly the same kind of thing. It's
exactly
Trump
the same problem.
Like, hey, I just told them to go walk over there and say some stuff. I didn't know they were going to do that.
Right. And even the hearings are sort of about those same language arguments in that way. And so, I mean, it's really interesting to see how, I mean, if so much of this argument is about like what it's going to be called when these little green men kind of inch over the border, they're not dashing, but they're maybe kind of oozing like in the general direction. And so it's like, oh, it's such a slow ooze. Like, I don't know, is it going that way? Like maybe like there, because it makes it so that there's less of a particular moment, like a decision point where things would go in the other direction, which just seems like narratively like an interesting, like it's a political problem and also it's also like a writing problem. And
it is.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's no consistency.
Exactly. And like, so, I mean, it seems like Jadon is such an interesting, like in your article, Jadon talks about his character Herman from the novel, let's see if I can get Voroshilovgrad.
Yeah, Voroshilovgrad.
Score. He returns to the past where for him the future begins is the quote that I'm thinking of from that. And this kind of sense of ending the forward progress of time and of returning to the past. There's this kind of like elliptical motion in there that even just reminds me of like the way that we're talking about the motion from Russia towards the Ukraine, like, oh, it's kind of like going, it's like this parabola of like, but it's sort of like going in that direction, but it's like so slowly that it's hard to track. But like the sense of ending the forward progress of time has been crucial to the Trump movement. And it's kind of make America great again and not make America great. And I wonder to what extent the Donbas region represents a possible future, not just for Ukraine, but for all of us, if more and more countries move away from the rule of law and toward a world that is more продажность.
Yeah, there are a few things to be said there. One of the things that novel is just, it's a brilliant novel, and it's extraordinarily translated by a young team of translators, Isaac Wheeler and Riley Costigan. And it's because of Jadon's uncanny ear for the spoken language. It's an extraordinarily difficult translation project. One of the things he captures so well is temporality and the sense of the Donbass as a space where time has somehow been suspended. And to some of the interesting analyses that came up when the war first started to break out, and there were attempts to Putin's, initial gambit was, well, there are CIA-sponsored Ukrainian fascists coming here to the East to massacre all the Russian speakers and to try to cast it as a kind of ethno-linguistic conflict. that was, a fiction in various ways. I mean, Ukraine is a bilingual country. Russian predominates more the more eastwards you go, but again, that's an oversimplification because it's really a bilingual country, and this was not a language that was under threat in any way, and there were not actually CIA-sponsored Ukrainian fascists coming to massacre anyone.
I'm shocked to find that out.
Well, one of the things that happened when I was there,
does that also mean there were no FBI who started the whole January 6th insurrection?
I know. Well, when I was first in Dnipro, which was still then Dnipropetrovsk, which was, quite close to the front line, but not on the front line. I'm not very brave. I wouldn't actually go into a war zone, but there were a lot of people I spoke to their families had divided, their friends had divided. They had come over from the Donbas to get away from the war and take the Ukrainian side. And other people had decided that, well, we have to let this happen because otherwise these Ukrainian fascists are going to come murder us. And people were saying to me, Marci, you'll never really understand the Soviet legacy. You'll never understand what that did to us. You'll never understand the lack of that democratic tradition, that people are so vulnerable, that they hear these stories on the internet or on television that, that Putin spins out, that it was a CIA-sponsored conspiracy, that they're Ukrainian Nazis, that they're coming to kill them. And people are so gullible that they believe it. You can't imagine this because you're American. And when I went back there in 2018, I said, I take your point, that I will never completely understand the Soviet experience the way people who lived it do. But those same Russian trolls who were spitting those stories, and sending them to the Donbas, 18 months later, they're spinning stories that Hillary Clinton was kidnapping children and holding them captive in the basement of a pizza place in Washington, and millions of Americans believe it, and it arguably swings the election, and a guy goes in with a gun to liberate the children from the non-existent basement. You can't blame Homo Sovieticus for that. You can't blame the Soviet legacy, but it turns out we're just as vulnerable.
We've done we did an episode on why Americans like Russian writers so much, but that was focused on Tolstoy and, Gogol and whatever, the great traditional writers from before the Bolshevik Revolution. I always think where are the great Russian writers now? And what I realized preparing for this episode and reading Zhadan's, I'm reading The Orphanage right now, which is over my shoulder. I realized this guy writing about the Donbas is the great Russian writer, and the other people who are some other Ukrainian writers that you want to talk about, I think are people that Americans need to be looking at, because his books are talking about what is happening in our country now and are useful in that way, as a sort of harbinger of writing about what America is facing as well.
One of the things I love about Sergei's writing, one of the things I love about literature, when it's good, when it's effective, it crosses those boundaries. You read Sergei's books and those people become human. Those people about whom we know nothing. When I was watching what was happening in 2013, 2014, I'm a historian, so I constantly had 1938, 1939 in my mind. I had Neville Chamberlain saying how horrible that we would be digging trenches and trying on gas masks, on behalf of some conflict between people in a faraway place about whom we know nothing. And I thought, yes, this is that conflict in a faraway place between people about whom we know nothing. That could be the thing that provokes the next world war. And Sergei writes about them in a way that you no longer know nothing about them, that they become human, that they resonate.
In our exchanges before this episode, you also mentioned the writer Rafinko, who I believe also has a new book coming out. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, I would love to talk about Vladimir Rafinko. He was one of my post-Maidan discoveries. I mean, not just my discovery, but he's somebody I met after the Maidan. And Sergei is from the Donbas. Sergei Zhadan is from the Donbas. He writes about the Donbas. He left as a student. He studied in Kharkiv, which in American terms is right around the corner, but it's not exactly there. And so he was not displaced by the war. He had been living in Kharkiv. He remained living in Kharkiv. He was brutally beaten up. It seemed like Kharkiv might be taken over by war, but it wasn't. So Vladimir Rafinko is a novelist. So Sergei writes these are both bilingual people, but Sergei writes in Ukrainian. Ukrainian is the language he writes poetry and novels in. Vladimir Rafaenko was always a Russian language novelist, and philologist, who taught the university in Donetsk. And he was from Donetsk. He stayed in Donetsk, and he didn't leave Donetsk until he's forced to flee at the beginning of the war. And so one of the themes that's very important, in Vladimir Rafaenko's work, is being a displaced person. What does it mean to be a refugee in your own country? And when I first met Vladimir, it was shortly after the war started, must have been 2015, perhaps, when he was briefly in Vienna on this fellowship. And I sat down to talk to him, and he was one of those, he reminded me of all the reasons I had fallen in love, with East European culture and, post-Soviet intellectual life, because he sits down and you pour coffee and immediately you're there with Kant and Hegel and Mamardashvili, and Chekhov and Berdyaev, and they're all right there, all those references. And he's like, I'm a Russian language writer, I'm a Russian philologist, nobody could love this literature more than I do. And now I can't even bear to watch Russian films. What has Putin done to me? What has he done? He's like, our Russian culture in Donetsk was not under threat. He destroyed it. He sent people like me into exile. And for somebody like Vladimir to have to flee from Donetsk, he was a novelist, of that time and place. I translated a kind of short, kind of mini novella within a larger novel he wrote that is set at the beginning of the war with an almost kind of Chekhovian precision, very, very tight. It's called Seven Dillweeds, that just captures the absurdity and the grotesqueness and the tragedy of this war that's happening for reasons that nobody really understands. Well, one of the things I did, by the way, during the pandemic, I was in Vienna and there was a lockdown. And during the very bleak winter, one of the very decadent things that I did that I didn't really have time to do, but I did anyway, was sit in on Vladimir's literature classes that he was then teaching from Kiev via Zoom. And since everything was on Zoom anyway, I thought, why not sit in? And he was, he taught Shakespeare in translation, he taught Hemingway, he taught Salinger, and he taught Chekhov. And listening to Vladimir teach Chekhov, he's a wonderful lecturer, and I would just it would just be these 2 hours of pleasure. I would just sit and listen to his beautiful Russian and listen to him go through Chekhov line by line. And I thought, nobody's going to love Chekhov the way Vladimir loves Chekhov. What Putin has done to people like that, ostensibly in the name of protecting Russian culture, is so grotesque.
Well, authoritarian leaders never like the artists, as we artists in America are going to remember when we see people like Trump running around. Thank you for joining us, Marci. We're going to end with a poem from Serhiy called Serhiy. Is that the right way to say it?
Serhiy.
Serhiy, called "Dictionaries in the Service of the Church," which you gave us a recording of it that is read by the poet Reginald Dwayne Betts, who's a past guest of the show. But before we go, we encourage all of our listeners to look up your writing on the Ukraine and Serhiy Zhadan's novels, which we will link to in the show notes.
And also Vladimir Rafaenko's Seven Dillweeds translation, which you also sent us, which we will tuck in the show notes as well. Marci, thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, thank you very much. And if you're going to tuck something in the show notes, his new novel that he wrote in Ukrainian for the first time, in some sense, the topic is also what it means to be a displaced person, changing the language you write. It's called Mondegreen, and it's just now coming out. And there's some wonderful passage in it that kind of capture the kind of existential tragedy of that displacement.
Terrific. Listeners, look at our Lit Hub Radio show notes where you can find links to that book and others discussed during this episode.